Well, when I first started reading Jung, I guess I'm probably not the only woman here, perhaps, who longed to be a romantic animal figure. That was a desire of which I felt rather ashamed, because a good feminist shouldn't harbour such thoughts. The psychological equivalent to wishing I looked like... I was saying that I felt rather ashamed of wishing to be a romantic animal figure, that it's the psychological equivalent to wishing I looked like Marilyn Monroe. There you go. Still don't. At the same time, I suspected and feared that in truth I was one of the opinionated animus hounds so despised by Jung, apparently. His observations always made me feel defensive, that my femininity was being attacked. And this combination left me with a very negative reaction to anima animus theory, and so for many years I put it to one side, able to exist quite contentedly without it. Nevertheless, it was a nagging irritation at the back of my mind. What has prompted me to try and tackle it again now? Having recently agreed to review the difficult, gripping biography of Jung by Frank McLynn, I have had to digest some unpalatable facts about him, and the disillusionment was painful. Jung emerges as, quotes, a rather questionable hero. Now that's actually a quote from Jung himself about the animus, which I thought was interesting. McLynn's biography and several other source books I have looked into, including Kerr's book, A Most Dangerous Method, which some of you probably know, detail Jung's relationships with actual women, his mother, his wife, his mistresses, including Sabina Spielrein and Toni Wolff, and his inner circle of female colleagues, who are sometimes known colloquially as the Valkyries. And it's here that I shall start. But before I start, they are the women of my title, then. Toni Wolff is the first wolf, as you probably will have guessed by now, and another is in Women Who Run with the Wolves, which I'm sure most of you will recognise as the title of a popular, perhaps populist book of stories and interpretations by the American writer Clarissa Pinkola Estes, which celebrates the wild woman. And recently another wolf has emerged. I keep finding them since I've been writing this. I left out Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf because I thought this could get silly, but another wolf I came across just last month or so is Naomi Wolf, whose work I have to say I haven't been familiar with, but her recent book Promiscuities has been widely reviewed, and it's part of the so-called contemporary feminist backlash, and perhaps you will have other associations, I hope so. I shall go on to say something about feminist reactions to Jung and his works, before going on to comment on the large body of literature by Jungian writers in America advocating a return to the goddess. That literature is stirring, and yet I feel ambivalent towards the goddess literature, perhaps because, as Andrew Samuels noted, it seems to involve the idealisation of women, a balance perhaps to denigration, but not really taking things forward, perhaps. I'd be interested in your experience of that. Finally, I shall briefly say something about how I see reactions to Jung's animus theory having developed within the SAP. I should say that this is rather a stereotypically feminine paper, in the sense that it doesn't have a particular point to make, but it's a collection of associations which I hope will invite yours. Jung's mother, Emily, was described by him as having two personalities. To quote from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his autobiography, "There was an enormous difference between my mother's two personalities. By day she was a loving mother, but at night she seemed uncanny, like one of those seers who is at the same time a strange animal. There were moments when her second personality burst forth, and what she said on those occasions was so true and to the point that I trembled before it. She early made me her confidant and confided her troubles to me." Very powerful feelings about his mother. When Jung was 3, she was hospitalized, possibly for depression, and that was for a period of some months, I think. Robert Smith, in The Wounded Jung, says, "This was the beginning of the Animar projection on a dark-haired maid who cared for him while mother was absent. From childhood," Jung said, "I always felt mistrustful when the word love was spoken." Jung's own two personalities seem to mirror those ascribed to his mother, and these are his own words, of course, as you will know. He described his personality number 1 as like an ordinary schoolboy, while number 2 was hidden, mistrustful, remote from men, but close to God. I'm going to move on to a section I've called Jung's Triangles. Jung married his wife Emma in 1903. I don't know how old he was, actually. I don't know if anybody else does. I think in his early or mid-20s. In 1904, Sabina Spielrein, who was then 19, came to the Bergholzli Hospital and was treated by Jung. She continued analysis with him after leaving hospital, while beginning her training as a doctor. In 1906, Jung and Freud had begun the correspondence, which developed into an intense friendship. Sometime in 1908, Jung and Sabina Spielrein became involved in a painful love affair, which continued on and off for the next 2 or 3 years. Kerr says, quotes letters, "At the beginning, Jung said she was his beam of light, and he was her Siegfried." Very romantic feelings. But then Jung wrote to Sabina, "I'm looking for a person who can love without punishing, imprisoning, and draining the other person. Return to me in this moment of my need some of the love and guilt and altruism which I was able to give you at the time of your illness. Now it is I who am ill." That was in 1908. It's obvious that they were in trouble. Both Jung and Sabina Spielrein consulted Freud about the relationship. When Jung wrote to Freud about his entanglement with, or by, as he saw it, a patient who was Sabina Spielrein, that was in 1909, Freud replied, "The way these women manage to charm us with every conceivable psychic perfection until they have attained their purpose is one of nature's greatest spectacles." Jung called Sabina Spielrein the medallion in his necklace of admirers, but eventually he broke the relationship off. Sometime later, Sabina Spielrein wrote a paper, "Destruction as a Cause of Coming into Being." That's been published, translated and published in the journal in 1994. The paper argues that destruction is an inevitable and necessary part of love. One cannot but consider its theme as having probably tremendous personal significance for her. After finishing her medical degree, in 1912, Sabine Spielrein left Zurich for Vienna, where she joined the psychoanalytic group around Freud. Freud wrote to Jung, "I must say she is rather nice, and I'm beginning to understand." At one meeting, she read part of her destruction paper, but it was more or less dismissed by Freud. Now it is viewed as containing some interesting ideas. It predated Freud's writing on the death instinct by 8 years. I don't know about his thinking, presumably he was thinking about it, and can also perhaps be seen as foreshadowing Winnicott's notion that destruction is a necessary part of the development of object relations. I'd like to think so, anyway. Perhaps that's a bit romantic of me. 1 year earlier, in 1911, Jung had begun treating Toni Wolff, who was 22, and came to him for help following her father's death and her own subsequent breakdown. Jung was then 35, had been married 7 years, and had, of course, only recently been involved with Sabine. Toni Wolff was gifted and intelligent, and within a year, Jung invited her to attend the Weimar Congress with himself and Emma. By this time, the close bond between Freud and Jung was breaking down. Sabine Spielrein attempted to mediate the increasing divergences between Zurich and Vienna, but a year later, in 1913, the men's relationship was also over. Years later, when married and 5 months pregnant, Sabine Spielrein wrote to Freud, saying she still longed for Jung. Freud replied, "I imagine that you love Dr. J so deeply still because you have not brought to light the hatred he merits." Yes, strong. Following the parting from Freud, Jung began to break down, what Jung himself called the confrontation with the unconscious, and Toni Wolff became his therapist, more or less. At some time, their friendship turned into a love affair. By 1915, Jung was so ill that Mrs. Jung let Toni Wolff come to live with them openly to try and calm him. Subsequently, Toni visited him every Wednesday and Sunday for many, many years. Jung regarded Toni Wolff as his femme inspiratrice, and she helped with his researches into mythology, as did many other women, of course. They continued to see each other until her death in 1953, although Jung omits to mention her in his autobiography. Toni Wolff became an analyst herself in 1929 and wrote works including Structural Forms of the Feminine Psyche. However, and this is a quote, "A friend who knew Toni well said of Jung, 'One can say that he was a big spoon, he drank her soul.'" As Demaris Vere observed in Jung and Feminism, unfortunately, as is usual with patriarchal history, we know very little about the women's side of the story. We do, however, have some of the letters between Sabine Spielrein and Jung, as well as some of her diary entries. We do know that Jung argued for polygamy and against fidelity in marriage, and that he apparently tried to analyse Emma's resistance to this idea. Nevertheless, despite her resistance, Emma stayed with him, as did Toni Wolff. There's further work to be done exploring these women's investment in sustaining the triangles. I think there is evidence that each of them may have been unconsciously using Jung and his theories to attempt some restoration of the masculine image or animus in their own lives. I shall say a little more about this later, but not in the depth it merits. Aldo Carota-Nuto prefaced his 1980 book about Sabine Spielrein, Jung and Freud with this quote from Goethe: "The past is fragile. Handle it as though it were red-hot iron." Jung, of course, had no analyst of his own to help in thinking about his experiences, and we have the benefit not only of hindsight, but also of a further 80 years of analytic thinking and experience to bring to it. Several analysts have offered interpretations about Jung's personality and how it might relate to his work. Winnicott and Satinova, for example. Here I'm going to say just a few things specifically about Jung's triangular relationships. It seems to me that there are two aspects to be considered. Firstly, his need to have relationships with two women at once, and secondly, his need to engage in illicit relationships. Quite a lot of attention has been paid to the first of these phenomena, which is, after all, not uncommon. There is plenty of potentially interpretable material about the impact of his split relationship to the maternal object, as evinced in his number 1 and number 2 personalities and so on. The second aspect, that Jung had affairs with patients, seems to me more problematic and has been little discussed. I suggest that here it is relevant to consider Jung's poor relationship with his dogmatic father, his subsequent initial excitement in getting close to Freud, his subsequent disappointment when Freud too demanded unquestioning adherence, and the father-son Oedipal dynamic which neither could tolerate. Jung began you could say, enacting his Oedipal problems with Sabine shortly after he met Freud, and this continued with Tony Wolff after their break. That's one way of looking at it. The irreconcilable difference between Jung and Freud was, of course, about so-called sexual theory, which is sad. How Jung may have enacted his internal conflicts within his relationships does not detract from the general usefulness of the theories he created from them, but perhaps it adds a different perspective. How are we doing? Okay. Thanks. I'm going to say a little bit about the theory of anima animus now, but I'm hoping that everybody knows what I'm talking about, so I'm not going to go into it much. But I'm asking, how might the history relate to the theory of anima and animus? At the time of the confrontation with the unconscious, Jung wrote that he was intrigued by the fact that a woman should interfere, this is a quote, "a woman should interfere with me from within." There's a sort of indignant tone, I think, understandably. From this, he posited the soul, or anima. The anima voice presented itself as, quotes, "a living figure within my mind," who told him that what he was doing was art, not science. This was not good news, I should say, from Jung's point of view. He said, quotes, "The insinuations of the anima, the mouthpiece of the unconscious, can utterly destroy a man." Carota-Nuto and Kerr suggest that this voice belonged to Sabine Spielrein, though if one accepts this principle, then the voice might perhaps be that of either of his mistresses. However, many commentators have noted that Jung tends to confuse the archetype of the anima with actual living women. I'm going to come back to that point quite a bit later on. Jung, as I'm sure you know, wrote extensively and lyrically about the qualities of the anima, man's unconscious contrasexual archetype. He said, "The anima-type woman must be sphinx-like, elusive, Mona Lisa, endowed with a naive cunning of more than doubtful chastity. One criticism that has been levelled at his anima-animus theory by de Maris Vere, for example, is that his picture of the anima is far more evolved and positive than that of the animus, the contrasexual archetype in women. Jung himself said that whereas men always understand what is meant by anima, I quotes, "I have as a rule found it very difficult to make a woman understand what the animus is, and I have never met a woman who could tell me anything definite about his personality." I don't know why I find that touching. Of the 40 pages of Molly, this is an aside really, but I'll put it in. Of the 40 pages of Molly Bloom's introspection, which ends Ulysses, Jung wrote to Joyce, "I suppose the devil's grandmother knows so much about the real psychology of a woman. I didn't." Rather endearing. He does speak of the animus, however. "The animus must be a master not so much of fine ideas as of fine words. Words seemingly full of meaning, which purport to leave a great deal unsaid. He must also belong to the misunderstood class, or be in some ways at odds with his environment, so that the idea of self-sacrifice can insinuate itself. He must be a rather questionable hero, a man with possibilities." He said, I'm sure this is getting to the nitty-gritty in a way of what is so difficult for many women, myself included. He said, "In intellectual women, the animus encourages a critical disputatiousness and would-be highbrowism, which, however, consists essentially in harping on some irrelevant weak point and nonsensically making it the main one. And I have to say that even doing this now, that is with me. There's no doubt about it. It's, I think, well, that's me." It's difficult. It sort of gets to you. Perhaps he's right. But oddly... Rubbish. Oh, thank you. Oddly, it struck me that it's Jung's own obstinate opinionatedness which makes his theory so unpalatable. Stripped of that quality, there's much of value, as I'll come back to, and I'm sure you would agree. I'm going to read you a quote from Jane Wheelwright, an American analyst, I think, who trained in Zurich, I don't know. And it's from a book of recollections. I don't think we've got that on the bookstall. It's in the library. "Jung was definitely the patriarch and was paternalistic, but I feel, because of his discovery of his anima and his enormous popularity with women, especially American women, he at least theoretically wanted women to improve their lot and make their legitimate way into the professions. He was not, however, altogether convincing in his behaviour. When I encountered him about the first appointment, he said he would discuss the time and day with my husband. I said, 'What about me?' with the usual American indignation. He said rather clumsily, 'That will come later.' Studying Jung's ideas, this is still Jane Wheelwright, I find him always theoretically standing for a woman's independence. At any rate, with the help of Jung's ideas about animus and anima, it was possible to reconcile the modern woman's movement and on the whole approve of it. Jung seemed to say that the new era can come through only by means of the feminine principle. Curiously, in a way, Jung did create an atmosphere around him in which intelligent women could live and thrive, whilst Freud did not, and certainly not at the beginning. Freud's original secret ring were all men, whereas Jung's inner circle were all women. Maggie Anthony, in a book called The Valkyries, The Women Around Jung, which I think is on the bookstore, very interesting book, described the group of women who gathered around Jung throughout the years, or who were perhaps unconsciously gathered by him. The first teachers at the Zurich Institute for Analytical Psychology were from this group of women, the Inner Circle. She relates a story that, and I quote, "A young man coming to Jung shortly before the Second World War was indignant about the women who seemed to form a human cordon around him. He said something to the effect that he didn't see how Jung could stand those old girls fluttering around him. Jung became very angry and told him that every one of the women was doing important and creative work, and that not only were they a help to him, but they were furthering the knowledge and understanding of psychology. He went on to say that they had come to him when they had not been able to function very well, but now they could. He admitted that they seemed to need a lifeline to him, and that he loved and respected them, even though it was a burden being the spiritual father who energized them and kept them in equilibrium." That's the end of the quote. I think this suggests that the transference, amongst other things, that the transference, counter-transference issues were never really resolved. But clearly Jung did take women seriously at the same time as holding the view that women related to life solely through men. This split was evident also in the women themselves, who spoke of negative animus whilst being intellectuals, who mostly remained single. For example, Marie-Louise von France said, "Many young girls refrain from studying or developing their minds because they rightly feel that if they did, they would fall into animus possession, and that would prevent them from marrying." Gosh, seems to be a bit long.
Just over 10 minutes.
Only 10 minutes?
Just over.
Just over. Right, okay. I'm just going to say a little bit about...
But the bell doesn't ring.
No, but my audience probably will. A little bit about feminist reactions to Jung's anima-animus theory. It's obviously been criticised, often as on the grounds of cultural relativism, by Jung's tendency to assign these archetypal qualities to a particular gender. And Warren Coleman, amongst others, who's written quite a lot about anima-animus in the journal here, speaks of the culture-bound essentialism of gender characteristics in Jung's theories, which reflect prevalent attitudes in Zurich at the time. Jung's thinking in this area aroused a great deal of adverse criticism from feminists. For example, Mary Daly said, "Particularly seductive is the illusion of equality projected through Jung's androcratic animus-animal balancing act. Since women are trained to be grateful for complementarity and token inclusion," there's a lot of real anger there. MacLean suggests in his biography that Jung used to be more popular than Freud with feminists because he placed a high value on the feminine. David Tacey points out, however, that many early feminists instinctively saw Jung as their natural opponent, for he was trying to put in stone what they were attempting to unravel and make fluid. End quote. I don't know if any of you saw the independent review of MacLean's biography, and a quote from there: "To call Jung flawed is to speak of the Grand Canyon as a crack. He deserves the hell of a feminist conference in eternal session." He manages to offend everybody, that quote is wonderful. Another feminist, Rosemary Reuter, is critical of Jung as more sexist than Freud, in that Jung translated the romantic notion of women into psychological doctrine. I won't go on. You've got the idea, I think. There have been various efforts to modify anima-animus theory to make it more acceptable to women and clinically useful. And I won't go into these in detail. I'll just mention some ideas which are linked to my main theme. I wanted to say something about Emma Jung, because she wrote a little book called The Animus and the Anima. As well as being clever, tactful, kind and rich, raising a large family of children and tolerating living with Jung, Emma also wrote about the animus and the anima. Mostly she follows Jung's line fairly faithfully, I think. For example, breathing a sigh of relief at the demise of the blue stocking. But her work on the animus is interesting, and I recommend it to you. I could read a lot of it, but I think given the time constraints, I'll just read this particular bit, a quote. Here I come to a very important difference between the animus problem of the woman and the anima problem of the man. When a man has to come to terms with his anima, he has to take up something which previously seemed inferior to him. He has to descend from a height. With a woman the case is different. It is far too easy for the woman to obey the authority of the animus or the man in slavish civility. Even though she may think otherwise consciously, the idea that what is masculine is in itself more valuable than what is feminine is born in her blood. What we women have to overcome in our relation to the animus is not pride, but lack of self-confidence and the resistance of inertia, as if we had to lift ourselves. We often fail for lack of courage and strength of will. It seems to us a presumption to oppose our own unauthoritative conviction to those judgments of the animus or the man which claim general validity. But without this sort of revolt, no matter what she has to suffer as a consequence, she will never be free of the power of the tyrant, never come to find herself. I think that's a very moving passage coming from Emma Jung. There's another bit which I could go into, but I won't, where she recommends the development of something called feminine intellectuality. And Margaret and I had quite an interesting discussion on the phone one day about whether there is such a thing, and if there is, what is it, and so on. I'm just going to say a little bit now about the traditions that have evolved, both as sort of from the anima animus work, first of all in America and then here. And as I've said before, in America there's a large literature devoted to the return of the goddess, starting with Esther Harding, who was one of Jung's inner circle, who set up the New York Analytical Psychology Club, and started a tradition, I think, of working on women's issues. She wrote a book called Women's Mysteries, amongst others. And there's a huge literature. There's something like over 700 references, I gather, in a bibliography which I fortunately didn't have, otherwise I'd have been even more frightened than I was about writing this talk. But a vast literature about exploring a lot of it, I think, the lost culture of the goddess in prehistory. There's a book which I think is here, for example, by Barker, Woolger and Woolger, explaining how the great... I can't remember what it's called. I haven't written down. You've got it, haven't you, beside you? Oh, it's not The Return of the Goddess, is it? That's Whitmont. Don't worry, it's there anyway. The Goddess Within is what it's called. It's just come to me.
Yes. Indeed, I'm hatching it as if it were an egg, yes.
It's the best way. It's a very readable, very interesting book about how the old mother goddess was worshipped everywhere until, thousands of years ago. Then the mother goddess was divided into departmental goddesses with personalities and roles, but of course lost absolute power. and eventually male gods and heroes supplanted the mother goddess cults and so on, and how with the arrival of Christian monotheism there's been only one God, the Father, how we've become, this is a quote, hardened, relentlessly heroic and grimly puritanical. We've lost the mother, as it were, lost the goddess. And there's a real passion and longing for a return to that strong feminine. And a hope. Edward Whitmont, in a lovely book called Return of the Goddess, says, amidst tremendous transition and upheaval, the goddess is returning. And it's very stirring. You look puzzled. I have to say, I thought, yes, it's wonderful to read, it's inspiring to read, and perhaps even a little inflating, I found. And then I, at times, began to feel slightly uneasy. Whitmont, for example, although he's critical of patriarchal structures, writes of dreams he had that implied the need to relate to a woman as if she were a goddess. And I began to think, help, hang on, I'm not, it gets a little bit too much. And it sounds a little bit like Jung relating to his anima figure again. I felt it had that same sort of rather grandiose quality or something. And I felt that the down-to-earth feminist critique had become obscured. But I think what is in here, and is very important, is some of the elements of the men's movement that David Tacey spoke of here recently, and describes in his new book, Remaking Maleness, which I recommend to you. I did press on with the goddess literature. I have to say I didn't read it all cover to cover, and part of the reason, I think, is because the language is very unlike the sort of rational, structured, academic language. And indeed that's one of the points that people speak about, that the language is masculine. The sort of academic language has been hijacked by a sort of masculine tradition, and that the storytelling tradition, where wisdom is enclosed in stories and characters and myths and so on, has been undervalued. And these books redress that balance by giving full rein to the stories and the characters in them. And I was tempted to tell you the story of Bluebeard as told in Women Who Run with the Wolves, because it seemed so apt to comment on Jung, but perhaps not. Instead, I thought I would just read you a very short verse I came about, because I liked it, about Inanna, or Inanna, I don't know how she's pronounced, goddess of Sumer. And it goes, the gods are sparrows, I am a falcon. The gods trundle along, I am a splendid wild cow. I just liked it. I'm going to finish, Margaret will be pleased to hear, with a few observations about developments here at the SAP. Some of Jung's inner circle were involved in setting up the Analytical Psychology Club in London, as I'm sure you know, and that the SAP was one of the developments from that. And here, post-Jungian analysts have pursued Jung's notions about the psychology of the transference in a way more congruent with psychoanalytic ideas, and this includes a different use of the anima-animus concepts, using an intra-psychic rather than an interpersonal perspective. Jung's long paper, The Psychology of the Transference, published in 1946 and dedicated to his wife, is a fascinating adjunct to the material we've been discussing. Using the alchemist's Rosarium Philosophorum as an allegory, he explores and explains the archetypal forces at work between couples at conscious and unconscious levels. That's all sorts of couples. He compares the analyst-analysand couple with the alchemists adept and soror mystica. Anima and animus are identified as the unconscious elements of the interaction. I'm sorry if it's a bit dense, this. I did do a little drawing of it so that, because it's hard to keep in your mind. This is Jung's, the top one is Jung's diagram.
You need to sit just to the side there.
Oh, right. Where shall I go? No, can't see it all. Sorry. Jung accepts Freud's emphasis on the transference as integral to the analytic work, but sees it as part of the individuation process rather than in Oedipal terms. He does not minimise the power of transference and countertransference feelings, and places the incest problem at the heart of his argument. Reading some of his heartfelt passages, one wonders whether he was reflecting on his own symbolically incestuous entanglements with Sabina Spielrein and Tony Wolff. Jung says here that, quotes, "It goes against nature to commit incest, and it goes against nature not to yield to an ardent desire. And," he says, "the right way, like the wrong way, must be paid for." As Maclin puts it in the biography, the danger for both partners was that they would be absorbed by each other's anima and animus and become identified with it. And this must be resisted at all costs in order to preserve the distinction between the real and the projected. From the structure of the diagram, Jung explained different elements of relationship at work, creating what he described as the greatest possible confusion. I think that the confusion he describes is that which entangled him and the women in his life. Well, of course, it entangles all of us. But that there are some important clues in his theory which might lead to more understanding. At one point, Jung observed, if man and woman are merged in some kind of unconscious identity, he will take over the trays of her animus, and she the trays of his anima. Marie-Louise von Franz made a similar observation. Discussing how men's anima projections and the psychology of woman are intertwined, she said, "Some women give in entirely to the anima projection. If he only likes her as an anima figure, she is forced to play the role of the anima. This interreaction can be positive or negative, but the woman is very much affected by the man's anima figure, which brings us to a very primitive and simple and collective level where we cannot separate the features of the anima and real women." Now I want to stress that cannot, because there's been so much work about, Jung's confusing the symbolic with the real woman and so on. And I think that what Marie-Louise von Franz is getting to is that it's not a confusion that can be sorted out that way. It's inevitable. It has a meaning. That's my theory anyway. I expect you'll have others. I hope you will. In both these passages, I recognise possible descriptions of the confusing processes of projective identification between couples. With the work of Melanie Klein and the post-Kleinians, these intuitions are rendered more understandable developmentally, and perhaps therefore less mysterious. The capacity of knowledge to contain allows these unconscious forces to be more thought about and tolerated, less acted upon than probably was possible for Jung. Interestingly, Melanie Klein first refers to projective identification in a paper published during the same year as The Psychology of the Transference, 1946. Michael Fordham, the major founder of the SAP, although steeped in Jung's ideas, was also interested in Kleinian and psychoanalytic thought. He incorporated this into his analytic work and developed important new theories, for example about working with transference psychosis and defences of the self. In his book Jungian Psychotherapy, he modified Jung's diagram to take account of the greater self-knowledge of the analyst than the patient, because of having undergone analysis. This, of course, did not apply to Jung himself. This lower diagram is Fordham's. The modifications are the green bits, if you can see. What you notice is that they're not going both ways, the arrows, whereas in Jung's they are. There's free flow.
I think some people will have to come and look at it
Afterwards.
afterwards.
Okay.
Can you be coming to a rounding to an ending?
Yes, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
If you consider Fordham's modifications carefully, they are about how the analyst can limit the effects of psychic infection through knowledge and technique. Fordham's work has obviously been developed by several analysts within the SAP. I've mentioned Warren Coleman, Colleen Covington, I think Daphne Lambert as well. So I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to finish by saying that Jung, as one of the pioneers, discovered the hard way about the power of the transference and countertransference. And through preparing this talk, I've come to appreciate more about his suffering and that of the women who were close to him, and I've learned from it.
Thank you.
That's it.